Okay guys, we are up to APUSH topic 5.6, failure of compromise. Now, like 5.4, I'll go ahead and tell you this one is a big topic, so there's a lot of ground to cover. So I understand if you need to pause and take a break every once in a while, because we got a lot of ground to cover in this video. Alright, let's get into it. So we are focused today on the major political causes of the Civil War. That's pretty vague, right? Political causes, that could be almost anything. But we're going to cover the specifics you need to know to know politically why we got into the Civil War. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is a guy from Illinois, a senator from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas. Despite his small stature, he was only 5'4", he was a big man in politics. They called him the Little Giant, and he was quite politically powerful. Now, what he does is he introduces into Congress this thing we're going to call the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what this would do is it would take the Nebraska Territory, which was all this through here, and divide it into two pieces, Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory. And there we would settle the issue of slavery based on popular sovereignty. So people in Nebraska, people in Kansas would both decide where they wanted slavery, or if they wanted slavery at all in their territory. Now, clearly, if we're going to open this area up to the potential for slavery, we are violating a law, right? We're violating the old Missouri Compromise. This 3630 line, we're going to kind of throw it out, potentially, anyways. Now, that means then the Missouri Compromise has to be repealed, and the Missouri Compromise had become almost sacred in American politics. The idea that we're going to throw that out was like shocking and scary for a lot of Americans. But Stephen Douglas, the Little Giant, has a lot of political willpower, and he's able to push this through Congress, even though a lot of people in Congress were very skeptical of this plan. I want to go back to the map just for a second. So the unwritten understanding was that even though both areas are up for popular sovereignty, that the understanding was this would become slave, this would remain free. That was, kind of wink, wink, that's the deal, basically. So we have, under the Compromise of 1850, everything in this light yellow was open to slavery. Now all of this is potentially open for slavery. So slavery now looks like it could take over from Canada to Mexico, potentially, right? And then for a lot of Northerners, they were not happy about that. They were furious about this plan. Like, are you kidding me? What? Free soilers in particular were just, this was like their worst nightmare. And being that Douglas is from a free state, Illinois, a lot of Northerners saw him as a traitor. Like, what are you doing? Why would you let slavery potentially expand beyond its area that it is right now? What motivated Stephen Douglas, possibly anyways, is the fact that he owned a lot of real estate in Chicago. And he knew that let me go back to the map here, if this territory were organized quickly, that might be where the Transcontinental Railroad would go through, and its terminus would ultimately be Chicago over here. So he knew Chicago would benefit from this. So this might have been just something that from his own personal profit motive here was trying to organize this plan. All right. Well, the effects were huge. I mean, a lot of Northerners were like, okay, this is the final straw. I'm not even going to think about obeying the fugitive slave law. Like, forget about it. I'm not doing it. The Democratic Party is going to be shattered on regional lines. There's going to be basically a Northern Democratic Party, a Southern Democratic Party, and it's going to give birth to a brand new political party, the Republican Party, modern-day Republican Party, guys. This is when it's born. So let's go out to Kansas and talk a little bit about what happens there and why it's a major step on the road to the Civil War. So Northerners thought, well, you know what, maybe we could take advantage of this whole arrangement out in the Kansas Territory. So even though it was kind of understood that the Kansas Territory was supposed to go slave and not go free, maybe if you get enough people out in Kansas and they believe in abolitionism, that maybe what they could do is they could actually swing the election and deny the Kansas Territory to the South. And some of these people are coming in armed, ready for a fight, because they know this is going to be a potentially bloody issue. Now, Southerners were furious about this. They're like, hey, wait a minute. I thought you said that this was going to go free and that was going to go slave, and now you got all these Northerners moving in here and trying to turn this around. That's not cool. And so the South decides to play this game too. And so in 1855, it's time for an election to establish a territorial legislature, and a lot of pro-slavery so-called border ruffians are crossing in from Missouri into Kansas to vote illegally in these elections to sway the election results. So again, you've got people coming in from Missouri, which is a slave state, of course, at this point, all the way from back to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And the South is trying to make sure that they get enough votes to keep slavery alive in Kansas. And this is going to be more than just talk. This is going to turn to actual fighting and killing. Violence is going to break out in Kansas over this issue. We call this Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces are going to clash, and they're setting up their own armed camps. There's two competing legislatures, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery being established. It's a mess out there. So let's get into Bleeding Kansas. And this painting, of course, is probably the most famous to depict Bleeding Kansas. And this guy in the middle, that's John Brown. So let's talk about John Brown a little bit in the context of this Bleeding Kansas. So John Brown was not from Kansas. He was from Massachusetts. And he's going to move his family from New England down to Kansas. And he's going there because he feels called. He feels called by God to lead a fight against slavery. He's a straight-up fanatic, someone who is absolutely dedicated to his cause. And he's there. He's going to move to Kansas to help try to push back against the pro-slavery forces. Well, in May of 1856, Brown and his sons actually murdered a group of 5 men at Pottawatomie Creek, and they said that this was revenge for an earlier attack on Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas being kind of an anti-slavery headquarters. It was attacked by pro-slavery forces. And this is just one more event in this open bloodshed between the two sides. And this is, Bleeding Kansas is kind of a civil war before the Civil War, basically. All right. Now let's take this back to Congress and see what goes on there. So a senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner decides he's going to, really lay it hard on the South. And he gives this speech, which which is known as the Crime Against Kansas speech, in which he condemns pro-slavery people. He condemns the South as being backwards and immoral. He condemns the state of South Carolina in particular, including one of its senators, a man named Andrew Butler. So this is just a really intense, just acidic speech against the South. Well, a congressman from South Carolina named Preston Brooks decided he had to do something to defend the honor of his state and his cousin, which was Andrew Butler. Go back here. Andrew Butler, the guy who Charles Sumner had attacked in the speech. He was cousins with Preston Brooks, and so Brooks, this is a family thing. It's a Southern thing. It's a South Carolina thing. Like I got to do something to strike back against Charles Sumner. And what he does, infamously, is on May 22nd, 1856, Brooks meets Sumner on the Senate floor and just beats the daylights out of him using his cane, his walking stick. Beats him until the cane breaks over the head of Charles Sumner. And Sumner, he is seriously injured to the point where he's going to have lasting effects and frankly, what we would probably call PTSD for years off in the future. Just another view of this. So if people are killing each other in Kansas over the issue of slavery, and we've got a near murder taking place on the floor of the Senate over the issue of slavery, it tells you that we are really at the boiling point, right? We're like 211 degrees or something, and we are so close to boiling over. Now, the reaction to this attack, People called Preston Brooks a bully, Bully Brooks. They condemn him. They point to this as, the Southerners talk about chivalry and honor, and here they are beating people up. They sell thousands of copies of Sumner's speech, so Sumner's words, anti-slavery, anti-Southern words, spread further than ever. The South is furious at the Northern reaction. They don't like the fact that the North is celebrating Charles Sumner and condemning Preston Brooks. And in fact, some members in the South actually sent Preston Brooks new canes as gifts, like as a thank you to beating a guy nearly to death on the Senate floor. All right, so now, guys, we are at a pretty high level of political toxicity. And so the election of 1856 is going to be one that is pretty intense. So the Democrats, I mentioned they're kind of splitting between northern and southern factions. It's not quite there yet. I mean, it's there, but it's not like official yet. There's still one Democratic Party, but its northern and southern wings are definitely going in opposite directions. They are demanding defense of popular sovereignty to allow slavery to expand. This new Republican Party is saying, no, they're not saying let's abolish slavery. What they're saying, though, is we need to stop its expansion. So wherever it's at, let's free slavery right there and not let it extend another inch. So let's go to the outcomes of the election. The Democrats are going to win under James Buchanan, and the Republican candidate John C. Fremont, a veteran of the Mexican War, comes in second, but for a brand new political party to get 114 electoral votes is pretty impressive. Former President Millard Fillmore, as the head of the Know Nothing Party, is going to get 8 votes. Electoral votes, I should say. So, if you recall, our big danger was the fear over regional parties. We don't want regional parties, and yet if you look at the map, that is exactly what we have. Republicans are only being elected in the North, right? There's no Republicans' votes in the South to speak of. Certainly no electoral votes anyways. What explains this? Well, a lot of Northerners who might have been tempted to go the Republican route and vote for Fremont are afraid that if Fremont wins, the South will secede, and that could lead to, obviously disunion. And so a lot of Northerners are frankly kind of intimidated by Southern talk of secession into voting for Buchanan or just staying out of the election altogether. And this fear over disunion is real. But it's also something the South has been playing before. The Texas or disunion, they had said in 1848. Now they're talking about it again in 1856. You can only cry sheep so many times, or cry wolf so many times before people start to say, wait a minute, why are we listening to you? All right, this now brings us to one of the most infamous court cases in American history, certainly one of the worst, and a major step on the road to the Civil War. So it's called the Dred Scott case. Let's talk about Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave, and his owner had taken him into non-slave territories and states. And his argument was that, well, if I'm in an area where slavery can't exist, I must not be a slave any longer. So he sues with help of anti-slavery forces. He sues for his freedom. He says, I can't be a slave in non-slave territories. Seems logical to me, of course. So this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in March of 1857, the Supreme Court decides, and in fact, they decide against Dred Scott, we'll say. And the decision was based on this idea that slaves can't sue because they're not citizens. In fact, Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, decided to take this even further. He says that not only are slaves not citizens and therefore they can't sue, so are anyone of African ancestry in America. So free blacks, they can't sue either, and they are also not citizens. But again, Taney wants to make sure that the issue of slavery is settled once and for all. So what he says is because slaves in his mind are property and the Constitution protects property, that slaves can technically be taken into any territory, any place where the American flag is flying. And therefore, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional all along. And frankly, he's basically saying there really is no such thing as a free or slave state, that Southerners have property rights that extend across all the states. Now, the reaction to this, as you can imagine, was swift and dramatic. For the South, they were absolutely giddy, because this gives them a legal foundation for their system of slavery and expansion of slavery. For people who believed in popular sovereignty, that the people should be able to decide, not the federal government, they were furious. Free soilers are going to be furious. This new Republican Party, furious. And in fact, a lot of people in the North, particularly Republicans, are like, you know what, we're not going to listen to it. Who cares what Roger Taney says? We're going to do what we want to do. And if we see slavery as wrong, like William Seward had told us, we have a higher law, God's law, then we'll do that. We just simply won't obey the Supreme Court decision. All right, this brings us now to John Brown once again, Mr. Bleeding Kansas himself, and his raid on Harper's Ferry. So John Brown was so dedicated to the abolition of slavery that he decided, you're not going to be able to do things politically. There's nothing's going to get done there. You're going to have to take direct action. You're going to have to use violence to end slavery. And his goal was, he was going to lead this raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. And the goal was to capture this armory, where there were lots and lots of weapons stored. And you're going to capture these weapons, and then when slaves across the South hear about this, they'll rise up, they'll all join together, you'll arm them with weapons from the armory, and a huge revolt of millions of slaves would take place. And this is, of course, a very, very ambitious plan, as you can imagine, and ultimately it's doomed to failure. About 20 people are going to die in this raid, but it does not result in a big uprising of slaves. Now, because guns and gunpowder were scarce, John Brown had a plan that in the interim, they would arm the slaves with pikes. So you're going to have pikes being given out to thousands and thousands of slaves to use as weapons. This is so-called John Brown's Fort in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. It was a fire station, basically, and this is where John Brown and his sons and his followers were holed up, surrounded, and eventually assaulted from inside this fort. John Brown himself was stabbed a couple of times with a bayonet. He survives, however, long enough to be put on trial, convicted of murder and treason, and sentenced to death. And this is John Brown heading off to the scaffolds. Now, the effects of the raid were intense. For a lot of moderates in the North, they were like, hey, listen, John Brown is crazy. He doesn't represent us. So a lot of Northerners who, they may not have liked slavery, and they may not have liked the spread of slavery, and they might have been upset by the fugitive slave law, they didn't see violence as a legitimate means of resisting slavery, however. But for hardcore abolitionists, they were thrilled by this. They are going to talk about how John Brown was a martyr, that he's just the first of many who are going to come along and fight for the end of slavery by force if necessary. From the Southern perspective, though, different. From the Southern perspective, what's going on here is a conspiracy that John Brown, in fact, represents the North, that the North is all anti-slavery and they're anti-South to the point where, they're going to constantly meddle in Southern businesses. They're even going to maybe invade the South and rid the South of slavery by force. So the South is super paranoid, super angry at the North because of what happened with John Brown's raid. All right, guys, I just threw a ton of information at you, of course, but it's important information. So make sure you understand the political causes of the Civil War. Today we looked at things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas. We looked at John Brown's raid. So just have a knowledge of all these topics and be able to write about them and put them in the right sequence to understand our road to the Civil War.